Armand Malfoy. Armand Malfoy was the first of his name to arrive in Britain, and he did not come alone. In 1066, he crossed the English Channel alongside William the Conqueror during the Norman invasion. Unlike many wizarding families who preferred secrecy and distance from Muggle politics, Armand saw opportunity. He aligned himself with power. Historical wizarding accounts suggest that Armand used subtle magical assistance to support the Norman cause. Nothing flashy, nothing that would expose wizard kind, but enough to ensure victory tilted in the right direction. When William claimed the throne, Armand was rewarded with prime land, estates that would eventually become the foundation of Malfoy Manor. From the very beginning, the Malfoys embedded themselves into aristocracy. They were not warriors like some old magical families. They were strategists, social climbers, political survivors. Armand established the Malfoy philosophy that would echo for centuries. Wealth is protection, influence is power, and proximity to rulers is survival. Interestingly, early Malfoys maintained close ties with Muggle nobility before the Statute of Secrecy in 1692. They did not yet fully embrace anti-Muggle ideology. That evolution would come later. But Armand set the tone, aligned with whoever holds the crown, and that instinct to stand beside power rather than oppose it would define the Malfoy bloodline, long after kings were replaced by noseless Dark Lords. Lucius Malfoy. Nicholas lived during a period when tensions between wizarding families and Muggle neighbors were quietly escalating. Unlike his ancestor, who preferred calculated alliances, Nicholas showed far less patience for coexistence. Records preserved in wizarding historical accounts suggest he became notorious for dealing harshly with Muggles, who encroached upon Malfoy-owned land. One particularly dark rumor follows his name, that he used magic to eliminate Muggle tenants who attempted to claim property rights near Malfoy estates. While the Ministry never formally prosecuted him, largely because the Statute of Secrecy had not yet been fully established, the stories persisted. Whether exaggerated or not, Nicholas represents a shift in Malfoy ideology. This was the era when the family began to view Muggles not as political tools, but as inconveniences, and that transition matters. The early Malfoys benefited from proximity to Muggle power structures, but Nicholas embodied the beginning of aristocratic disdain. Wealth had been secured, influence had been established, now came superiority. It is during generations like Nicholas's that the Malfoy name began accumulating its reputation for intimidation. They were no longer simply wealthy landowners with magical advantages. They were feared, and fear, unlike political favor, does not depend on alliances. Nicholas may not have been a Death Eater. Centuries separated him from Voldemort, but the mindset that would later welcome dark ideology was already forming. Lucius Malfoy I. Long before the silver-haired Death Eater the world would come to know, there was another Lucius Malfoy, ambitious, calculating, and dangerously close to the Muggle throne. Lucius Malfoy I lived during the Elizabethan era, a time when magical families were being forced to reconsider their relationship with the non-magical world. Unlike later Malfoys who championed strict separation, Lucius I still believed influence over Muggle royalty could be strategically valuable. Wizarding records suggest that he attempted to court Queen Elizabeth I, allegedly seeking marriage or political proximity to consolidate Malfoy dominance at the highest level of English power. The plan failed. The Queen reportedly resisted his advances, and whispers claim magical interference may have been uncovered or suspected. After this humiliation, the Malfoy stance began to shift dramatically. When the International Statute of Secrecy was established in 1692, the Malfoys publicly supported separation from Muggle governance. But privately, this was more than ideological. It was pragmatic. If they could not rule from beside the crown, they would instead rule from the shadows of wizarding society. Lucius I marks a turning point in the family's philosophy, from aspiring royal influencers to insular pure-blood aristocrats. The family began distancing itself from Muggle political entanglements and doubling down on wizarding elitism. What had once been ambition became isolation. What had been opportunistic alliances became pure-blood purity ideology. The Malfoys no longer sought Muggle approval, they sought magical dominance. Brutus Malfoy. Brutus Malfoy likely lived in the early 18th century, born shortly after the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy was enacted in 1692. By the time he came of age, the wizarding world had already withdrawn from Muggle society. Separation was no longer debate, it was law. That legal divide changed everything. Unlike earlier Malfoys who navigated proximity to Muggle power, Brutus grew up in a world where contact with non-magical society was restricted and heavily regulated. But while most pureblood families focused on quiet preservation, Brutus chose something louder. He became editor of Warlock at War, an aggressively anti-Muggle publication infamous for inflammatory rhetoric and open hostility toward non-magical people. This was no longer subtle aristocratic superiority, it was ideological reinforcement in a post-secrecy world. Brutus used print media to argue that wizardkind was inherently superior, and that interaction with Muggles weakened magical society. The statute may have enforced physical separation, but Brutus pushed cultural separation. For the first time, the Malfoy name became publicly tied to ideological extremism rather than just wealth or political maneuvering. Unlike Nicholas, who acted in private, and Lucius I, who operated through ambition, Brutus shaped narrative, and narrative shapes generations. Septimus Malfoy. Septimus Malfoy lived in the late 1700s to early 1800s, when the Ministry of Magic had fully matured into the central authority of wizarding Britain. The Statute of Secrecy was no longer new, it was infrastructure, and Septimus understood that infrastructure meant opportunity. He didn't chase ideology in newspapers like Brutus. He didn't flirt with Muggle crowns like Lucius I. Septimus embedded the Malfoys where power truly settled, inside the ministry itself. Holding a senior position, he cultivated long-term alliances with influential officials and traditionalist pure-blood families. His strategy was simple but enduring: proximity to decision-makers. And the network Septimus built didn't disappear when he did. They became the family's invisible armor. Generations later, Lucius Malfoy would rely on ministry influence, donations, leverage, quiet pressure, to maintain the Malfoy name at the center of wizarding power. Abraxas Malfoy. Abraxas Malfoy is the bridge between the old money, old secrets Malfoys and the Malfoys we actually meet in the modern wizarding world. Canon-wise, Abraxas is best known for one thing: he's Lucius Malfoy's father. And that matters because it tells you exactly what kind of household Lucius was raised in. Pure blood pride, political calculation, and a belief that the world should naturally bend in the Malfoys' direction. Abraxas also had direct social access to the very top. He personally knew Horace Slughorn, not as a random student, but as the kind of well-connected pure-blood parent Slughorn would remember by name. Slughorn describes Abraxas as a man with wonderful connections. And in the wizarding world, that's basically code for he could make doors open, careers happen, and problems disappear. And then there's the detail that quietly screams Malfoy energy. Abraxas once tried to pressure the ministry over policies benefiting Muggle-born witches and wizards. During the tenure of Nobby Leach, the first Muggle-born minister for magic, Abraxas was among those who openly opposed his leadership. When Leach abruptly resigned due to a sudden illness, many suspected foul play from powerful pure-blood families. Nothing was ever proven, but the timing was convenient. By the time this chapter ends, Abraxas has done his job. He produces an heir, Lucius, and hands down the Malfoy blueprint: influence first, prejudice second, and pride always. Lucius Malfoy, born into wealth, raised on pure-blood superiority, and educated at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Lucius inherited not just gold, but ideology. Sorted into Slytherin, he quickly became the polished face of old wizarding aristocracy, articulate, influential, and always dressed like he owned the room. During the First Wizarding War, Lucius joined Lord Voldemort's inner circle as a Death Eater. But unlike the reckless fanatics, Lucius operated strategically. When Voldemort fell in 1981, Lucius didn't go to Azkaban. He claimed he had acted under the Imperius Curse, and thanks to his wealth, donations to the ministry, and carefully maintained relationships, he walked free. Throughout Harry Potter's school years, Lucius functioned as Voldemort's political extension. He manipulated ministry officials like Cornelius Fudge, attempted to discredit Albus Dumbledore, and even planted Tom Riddle's diary on Ginny Weasley, unknowingly setting loose a Horcrux inside Hogwarts. But Lucius's greatest strength, control, eventually became his weakness. After failing to retrieve the prophecy at the Department of Mysteries, he was imprisoned in Azkaban. His fall marked a turning point. The Malfoys were no longer untouchable. By the Second Wizarding War, Lucius loses Voldemort's trust, his wand, and eventually his status. Yet the most revealing truth about Lucius is this: when power collapses, the Malfoys don't die for ideology. They cling to family. Narcissa Malfoy. Narcissa Black was born in 1955 to Cygnus Black III and Durella Rosier, making her a direct descendant of the ancient and obsessively pure House of Black. She grew up at a time when the Black family motto, toujours pur, wasn't just tradition, it was law. She was the youngest of three sisters, Bellatrix, the fanatic, Andromeda, the rebel, and Narcissa, the diplomat. When Andromeda married the Muggle-born Ted Tonks, she was burned off the Black family tapestry. Bellatrix embraced Voldemort. Narcissa stood in between, loyal to blood ideology, but not driven by fanaticism. She attended Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where she was sorted into Slytherin and likely met Lucius Malfoy there. Their marriage wasn't just romantic, it was strategic, a union between two elite pure-blood houses, consolidating influence, wealth, and status. But Narcissa's defining trait wasn't pride, it was protection. Everything she did during the Second Wizarding War centered around Draco. She begged Severus Snape to protect him. She defied Lord Voldemort by lying about Harry's death. In that moment, she chose family over fear. Draco Malfoy. Draco was born on June 5, 1980, into silk robes, silver cutlery, and a last name that opened doors before he ever touched a wand. Raised at Malfoy Manor by Lucius and Narcissa, Draco didn't just inherit wealth, he inherited expectation. From childhood, he was taught that blood mattered, that the Malfoy name was not something you carried lightly, it was something you defended. When he arrived at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry in 1991 and was sorted into Slytherin, he immediately embodied everything the name represented. He mocked Ron Weasley's poverty, he sneered at Hermione Granger's Muggle-born status, calling her a mudblood without hesitation. He positioned himself as Harry Potter's rival before their first year had even properly begun. Draco wasn't subtle. He was performative, loud, arrogant, obsessed with proving he belonged at the top of the wizarding hierarchy. He reported Hagrid for illegally raising a dragon and later exaggerated his inquiry after provoking Buckbeak, nearly getting the hippogriff executed. He flaunted his father's influence whenever things didn't go his way, and yet, looking back, it feels less like cruelty born from nowhere and more like a boy rehearsing the script he was raised on. The war stripped that script away. At 16, Draco was branded with the Dark Mark and tasked with assassinating Albus Dumbledore, an assignment meant to prove loyalty, but one that exposed how unprepared he truly was. His confidence cracked, his arrogance thinned into fear. On the Astronomy Tower, Draco managed to disarm Dumbledore, but when the moment came, he couldn't say the words. His wand trembled, he hesitated, and that hesitation changed everything. Severus Snape, bound by the unbreakable vow he had made to Narcissa, and acting under a prior agreement with Dumbledore, stepped in and cast the killing curse himself. Draco survived the war, not as a victor, but as someone who had seen the cost of the ideology he was raised to defend. After Voldemort's fall, he avoided prison, largely because Narcissa's lie in the Forbidden Forest helped save Harry Potter. The Malfoys kept their fortune, but their reputation never fully recovered. In the years that followed, Draco rebuilt quietly. He stepped away from politics and blood supremacy, determined to break the cycle he had inherited. He found love and dedicated to build a family with Astoria Malfoy. Astoria Malfoy was born Astoria Greengrass, a member of one of these sacred 28 pure-blood families. On paper, her marriage to Draco Malfoy looked traditional, another strategic union between elite wizarding houses. But in reality, it marked a quiet revolution. Unlike many in older pureblood circles, Astoria did not support the rigid blood supremacist ideology that had fueled two wizarding wars. Post-war Britain was rebuilding, and Astoria belonged to a generation that had seen the cost of extremism up close. She did not deny her heritage, but she refused to let it define her morality. And that influence on Draco mattered. While Draco had already stepped back from Voldemort's ideology after the Battle of Hogwarts, Astoria helped ensure that the next Malfoy would not be raised in fear or fanaticism. They eventually had a son, and for a few years they raised him together in a quieter Malfoy manner than the one Draco had grown up in. But Astoria carried a hereditary blood curse that had gradually weakened her over time. Despite every effort to manage it, the illness ultimately shortened her life. After her death, Draco was left to raise their son alone, a boy named Scorpius Malfoy, and with him the next chapter of the Malfoy legacy begins. Scorpius Malfoy. The son of Draco Malfoy and Astoria Greengrass, Scorpius grew up in a post-war wizarding world. By the time he arrived at Hogwarts, Voldemort was gone, the Ministry had resurrected, and the pureblood obsession that once defined his lineage had begun to lose cultural dominance. But the Malfoy name still carried shadows. Rumors followed him before he ever spoke a word. Whispers claimed he might secretly be Voldemort's son, a cruel fabrication born from fear and lingering suspicion toward the Malfoys. Scorpius, however, proved to be nothing like the image projected onto him. Sorted into Slytherin, he formed an unlikely and genuine friendship with Albus Severus Potter, the son of Harry Potter. That friendship alone symbolized something historic, the heirs of two rival bloodlines choosing connection over inherited animosity. Scorpius is intelligent, socially awkward, and openly kind, traits rarely associated with the Malfoy stereotype. He does not posture, he does not intimidate, he questions, he empathizes. Where Armand aligned with conquerors, Nicholas instilled fear, and Lucius chased dominance. Scorpius represents something unprecedented, a Malfoy without supremacy. He is the first in centuries to carry the name without actively reinforcing its old values. In him, the bloodline bends, and for the first time, the future of the Malfoy family may not be defined by power, but by choice. But you know what's even crazier? All 10 major events after the Deathly Hallows explained in detail. That's your next lesson here at Stickman Hogwarts. Watch now before the Sorting Hat starts questioning your priorities.